Okay, everybody, welcome to the latest knowledge network on Climate Assembly call. This one is going to be focused on the attitudes of policy actors to climate assemblies. Before we start, I'd just like to introduce Knoca to people. I'm not everybody who comes on our call. For many people, it's their first time engaging with the network. The Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly aims to improve the commissioning, the design, the implementation, the follow-up and evaluation of climate assemblies. We do this through a number of ways. One is documenting current practice. Another is identifying and disseminating best practice for impact. And the third is to try and shape innovation in climate assembly practice. We do a lot of this work through co-creation of knowledge with members of the Knoca community. One of the things we established towards the end of last year was a series of knowledge development projects. We felt that as a network, we should try and devolve responsibility for the creation of knowledge and also for developing network activities. And it's for one of those knowledge development projects that this event has been organized. And this knowledge development project is being run by Alina Avachenkova, who is from the Grantham Institute at the LSE, is also on the management committee of Knoca. And we charged her with trying to understand the attitudes of climate policy actors towards assemblies. And the reason for that was twofold. It was one, to try and understand the key barriers and opportunities for the greater use and stronger impact of climate assemblies more generally. And the second was to think through for Knoca itself about how it engages with climate policy actors. When we established Knoca and looked at the initial membership, it was clear that we were not necessarily achieving our target of engaging with those particular actors. So that's what Alina has been focusing on. It's a real pleasure for me because I'm actually going to hand over to Alina to run the rest of this event, as most of you know, and that'll be a pleasure for you as well, because most of you have to put up with me hosting most of the events. But I'm absolutely delighted that Alina is taking responsibility for today's event. She'll be making a short presentation about her work. Will be followed by a short panel with questions and answers, and then we'll have a chance, hopefully, to break out into groups more deeply in this question of how we engage more effectively with climate policy actors. I'd like to pass over to Alina.
Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. It is a great pleasure to share with you the results of the analysis on the attitudes of climate policy actors towards citizens' assemblies. So I think Graham has already outlined the key objectives of the project, but here I again to understand how climate actors perceive climate assemblies, what are the key knowledge gaps, and what are the barriers and opportunities for making climate assemblies more impactful and engaging climate actors in assemblies at scale. And in that context, we are particularly interested also, what can we do as Knoca to help and address some of those challenges. So the project was based on the literature review, and most learnings we've done were from the interviews with experts. And you can see here we've interviewed 27 experts covering national expertise from 15 European countries. There is a good balance of policymakers, politicians, climate civil society experts, and policy advisors. But we also talked to assembly organizers and experts who advise them. So in the next 12 minutes or so, I'm going to give you some of the key messages that we have picked up from this analysis. This will be followed by the discussion with great panel representing different perspectives, civil society, politics, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss with all of you in more detail also in the breakout groups. So when we talk about misconceptions and barriers to climate assemblies, some of the key messages which came through is that there is still misunderstanding and actually the feeling, a perception that people, citizens, non-experts can't handle discussing complex issues such as climate change. And oftentimes they're seen as naive individuals or being subject to lobbyist influences and therefore are not suitable for seeking advice on such a complex matter. There is also a fear that recommendations would come at a low level of ambition, which those of us who engage with climate assemblies know that based on current experience, that has not been the case. And finally, there is a confusion oftentimes and perception that assembly would be taking decisions rather than advising and proposing a course of action. And connected to that, there is a threat to the challenge of the role of parliament, where in particular parliamentarians see themselves as legitimate representatives of people, and fear of lost control, which comes a little bit also from civil servants that sometimes are nervous that citizens' assembly might actually question the course of action that they have already planned to undertake. There are also concerns in particular from NGOs that assembly process is not accessible to a wider range of stakeholders, and therefore there is a need to ensure that there are other entry points and other ways to engage both with general public but also with stakeholders. Well, as a result, what we're seeing is that generally in quite a number of countries, there have been either direct objections or lack of support from environmental civil society to climate assemblies. And there is a perception that potentially that has been one of the factors that has contributed to some of them having a lower impact on climate policy. Perceived risks of holding climate assembly are lack of clear mandate, as I mentioned, perception that there will be decisions taken rather than recommendations, and also some experts saw it as a rather convoluted way to learn about what people think. Another risk is that mismatching expectations around what can actually be achieved given the budget that the Climate Assembly has and the impact that is expected of it. Many experts are concerned that the lack of response to the assemblies by the political process might actually discredit the instrument and lead to backlash rather than helping achieve more ambitious climate policy. And badly managed process can discredit the instrument. So I wanted to share some quotes with you here, some around the concerns of the Citizens' Assembly. And one that I particularly like is actually by the Civil Climate Assembly expert, which said that the main misconceptions, both within the public as well as within civil society, politicians and policymakers, is that they greatly underestimate people. I think that sums up quite a lot of things that we have heard through the interviews. And another one which is an important concern among the NGOs, which I have mentioned, is that if Parliament and government disagrees with the recommendations from citizens and says we have a different take for this and that reason, that is legitimate. And if that is understood, then climate assemblies are very helpful. If not, and if the expectation is that the assembly is making decisions, then I would say that it's really harmful. So that really highlights the importance of clarifying what is actually the role of climate assembly within the broader system of climate governance. And finally, the concern that in particular talking to civil servants, this fear of uncertainty. This last quote, I think, is a very informative one by a commissioner of an assembly, which basically points to the fact that if you take a decision to use an assembly approach, then you're opening yourself up to the possibility that people come with ideas that you haven't considered or are at odds. So you need to have a good understanding of how you're going to handle that. And that's what I usually see people haven't really thought about early on. Now, the perceived benefits of, so we also discussed, so I apologize, the title of the slide is incorrect, but the benefits of climate assemblies that climate policy actors see, they actually concern the importance of bringing a lived experience of citizens to ensure that policies that policymakers develop don't miss issues important to people's lives. So it was very important to understand that many climate actors I spoke to actually recognize the value of bringing that experience. And also the value of citizens' assemblies in reaching to those who are usually not part of public opinion consultations and surveys. A few actors actually recognized climate assembly as being an effective instrument for discussing difficult policy issues, in particular just transition poverty, fuel poverty, and issues around a social aspect of climate policies. And climate assemblies currently have high visibility and therefore could potentially have high impact. That was the view from a number of policy actors I've interviewed, with the caveat, of course, that so far this has been the weakest point and we need to do more to ensure impact of climate assemblies. And finally, I wanted to highlight that a few actors saw that climate assemblies can make it clear that public has appetite for ambitious climate action and can actually challenge the view of what is possible and could be supported by the public. Again, here are some quotes, and I wanted to bring one from the Member of Parliament of the UK, who said that one of the most important outcomes of the Climate Assembly in the UK was for the government to find that in certain ways the public actually is ahead of their own thinking and is prepared to go further and faster than the government might have expected. And that is the essence of why climate assemblies could actually be a very important instrument to help climate policy actors advance on the objectives of ambitious climate policy. We also discussed in the course of the project what is the potential of climate assemblies, is there potential in the context of the European climate policy? And the views have differed on that issue. And I'll be very interested to hear what our panel has to say on that, as we have some experts in European climate policy. But it has generally been a feeling that the EU policy operation at the moment is quite challenging and inefficient, and it might be difficult for a citizens' assembly on climate, the European-wide, to have a real policy impact. That is also an issue that many NGOs focused on European climate policy really have little capacity to focus on citizens' engagement at the moment, as they are absorbed with other issues around Green Deal and the implementation of the European climate law. However, there are also several opportunities that we have identified, and generally social movements and the fear of backlash and delayed climate policy created more willingness generally to have citizens' engagement to foster social acceptance at the EU level. And citizens' assemblies are generally seen as one way of doing that. And specifically, the EU governance regulation requires that each country holds multi-level dialogues on climate policy. And that effectively offers opportunity to introduce more deliberative instruments into national policymaking processes. However, at the moment, at the EU level, there are no rules or reporting requirements in this respect. There have also been proposals to include a call for EU multi-level climate and energy dialogue platforms to become part of more permanent and deliberative process. Very quickly on the views on the EU level assembly were that it might be a good way to connect politicians and citizens at the European level more closely. However, the majority of experts felt that national climate assemblies is the main avenue forward. They might be complemented by the European level one, but most effective way, I think the expert felt, was to include European related questions into national climate assemblies. There was strong need to include not only voices from Western and Northern Europe if a climate assembly was conducted, and the importance of focusing the topic on something that has relevance across all of the European countries, and some examples were adaptation tools, social justice issues, food security, and energy security. And of course, an important question is who would actually receive recommendations if a European Climate Assembly were held. So that would need to be discussed. Now, to conclude, I wanted to share with you some of the ideas which came up in terms of how we can overcome the barriers. And first point, of course, is in improving awareness on climate assemblies among the climate policy actors, and understanding political motivations for involving citizens in discussing and recommending policy options, and articulating the value of involving the public in those discussions, the climate policy actors. It was also noted that it's important to consider assembly as part of the broader climate governance. How does it fit vis-a-vis National Climate Advisory Body, the Parliament, the civil servants designing policies, and other stakeholder consultations. And the importance of getting sequencing right. You can't hold an assembly after the decision has already been taken. So ideally, it's at the beginning or early on in the political process. So I'll stop here, and the questions for today, which we'll have time to discuss later in the breakout groups, but I wanted to set them in your mind so you can start thinking about it, and also preparing your questions for the panel along those lines. What are additional barriers around climate assemblies in the climate policy community that we need to address? What can Knoca do to address those barriers and engage climate actors around climate assemblies at scale? And finally, what actors should we engage in particular in this context? So with this, as you start thinking about that, I'll conclude and I'll go to the panel. We have excellent speakers and experts with us today. So firstly, Chris Shaw, who is clerk at the Foreign Affairs Committee at the UK Parliament. Chris has had first had involvement with the UK Climate Assembly. Then we have Alex Mason, who is a Director of Energy and Climate Program at WWF and has years of experience engaging with the European climate and energy policy. And last but not least, we have Stephanie Brancaforte, who is the Executive Director of Change.org and has experience in both worlds of climate policy and deliberative democracy. So very warm welcome to all of you. So we're going to start with Chris. And Chris, from your perspective, working with politicians and the members of parliament, do the findings of the analysis resonate, and what do you see as the key barriers for effective engagement of parliamentarians and politicians with climate assemblies?
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Alina, for that question. So as Alina says, I'm coming from the perspective of an official in Parliament who worked to get the first Citizens' Assembly on climate change up and running in the Parliament, and that meant persuading officials and politicians to invest in the project in the first place, persuading them that it was a worthwhile thing to do, and then obviously liaising on the delivery of the assembly before trying to persuade both Parliament and government to engage with the findings and outcome of the Citizens' Assembly. So yes, many of those findings do resonate, Alina, and I just want to pick up on one or two. And you know, this is all anecdotal evidence from me, having done quite a lot of anecdotal conversations. I guess the two that resonate strongly with me are, one was about the ceding of power, or at least influence, by politicians, was something that they struggled to overcome in many cases. This is particularly true of government rather than parliamentarians, I think. You know, as parliamentarians, they do have influence, but their power is limited. So I think they were prepared to share a little bit more their influence in terms of giving another body an opportunity to have a say on policy making, whereas government, they were a lot more reluctant to cede any sense of ceding control of the policy making agenda. A common comment in Parliament was, you know, we are the Citizens' Assembly, and they saw themselves as the harbinger of the views of the people. You know, and I had to point out gently as possible, no, you are actually professional politicians with a personal and a political agenda. You're not just an ordinary person in the street who's not necessarily interested in politics. So that was an education, I think. And again, we had to persuade them that the Citizens' Assembly was there to inform Parliament, inform decision making. It was advisory. It wasn't replacing them. So I think we just, as we developed the proposal, we just had to go quite strongly on that nuance there as we met opposition. And I think once we persuaded MPs that this was designed to feed into their work, not to supersede it or replace it, I think we got a better reception. I think civil servants actually found it very useful, the work. I said government were a bit suspicious. That's true. At a ministerial level, that is true, they were. But when we spoke to civil servants, throughout the process and at the end of the process, they found the findings of the Climate Assembly extremely helpful in policy formulation, not necessarily in guiding the policy direction, but in learning how to sell that policy. So, for example, we got a good firm views on nuclear power and on carbon capture and storage, and that was useful to civil servants, realizing that they had a problem in selling current government policies in these areas. So I think that was helpful to them. I think finally, in that question, it was noticeable that there was more support on the left than on the right of the political spectrum for the idea of a Citizens' Assembly. And I think we had to work quite hard to keep a cross-party consensus on that. And the more you can do so, obviously, the better. There was particular support on the green campaigning side of things, I guess, and that was problematic in a way because some politicians saw it as a campaign, part of a campaign on delivering net zero. So that wasn't particularly helpful, and we had to persuade, no, this is an independent exercise, absolutely independent, and we worked hard to preserve that independence, and that did give it a higher degree of authority. So turning to how to get politicians to pay more attention to Citizens' Assembly, I think part of it is education, helping them to understand what the purpose is and what they're not there to do. But I think the one piece of research that I think is missing, as far as I'm concerned, and this is something that maybe Knoca can pick up upon, because I think it might be helpful in showing the value of deliberative democracy in general, is evidence showing that policies are more likely to be publicly acceptable if they have gone through the ringer of a citizens' assembly or something similar. And that comes from the basis that in the UK, at least, there's very little trust amongst politicians across the board. And so anything that they come forward with at election time and outside of election time is not necessarily taken at face value. If it's being proposed by politicians, it's instantly going to alienate at least half the population. But I think if it can be shown that this policy is endorsed by people like them, people like us, just ordinary people in the street, then some research suggests that has it has some resonance and is more likely to be accepted by the politicians if they can see a policy is going to be popular because it's gone through that citizens' assembly. The example that I've drawn is we have a unit in the UK we did have called the Nudge Unit, and they found that I think the example was just the paying of a bill on time. Instead of letters through the door saying, please pay your bill on time, please pay your bill on time, the most effective way of getting them to pay the bill on time was to say, your next door neighbours has paid your bill on time, your whole street has paid the bills on time. What about you? And maybe the same applies to policies, but I think that, I don't know the answer. That would be an interesting piece of research to do potentially, and really to make citizens' assembly the new focus group. I mean, the focus group were popularized in, I guess, 30, 20, however many years ago, and were the sort of go-to testing ground for new policies. And but they're not, they're obviously limited. Whereas a citizens' assembly for certain big policies, not necessarily every policy, I think if that became the normal way of testing these policies, both outside and inside parliaments, I think that is that is a way to mainstream them, to use that horrible word, to mainstream a deliberative democracy as part of the policy making process. So I think, just to conclude, I think that the politicians need to be given the confidence to trust the people. And that remark that I think you quoted, Alina, about people going ahead of the government, I think that was very prescient, because that's certainly our experience. But the governments don't have the confidence at putting forward radical solutions that are going to cost people either convenience or money. And I think the Climate Assembly and other assemblies have given government confidence that where people understand the issues, understand the extent of the problem, they are prepared to countenance, or at least they say they are prepared to countenance radical solutions. And I think that can be a help to politicians. And if they can be persuaded of that, then I think that would be helpful. I'll stop there. Thank you, Alina. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Fascinating experience, and also for sharing your very good suggestions on what additional research could be helpful. Very much appreciated. We're going to have an opportunity to ask questions to all panelists. As Graham said, please put them in the chat as they come. In the meanwhile, I'm going to go to Alex. So Alex, you have quite a lot of experience working in particular with civil society, but also, of course, politicians at the European level. What's your take on the findings, and why do you think civil society, climate NGOs in particular, haven't prioritized that much the engagement with citizens' assemblies so far?
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Graham, for inviting me to speak. I should just clarify, I'm not actually director of climate and energy policy, but I'm, I suppose, team leader for climate and energy policy in WWF European Policy Office here in sunny Brussels. Yeah, I mean, most of my career actually has been spent as a civil servant, both in the British government and the European Commission. But I've been in WWF for 6 years now, so have also been working obviously very closely with other NGOs and our EU network, and have been picking their brains on civil assemblies, which I'm not personally a huge expert in. I think, I mean, looking at your findings, I feel a lot of that stuff rings true for us. A lot of the comments and things that Chris has just been saying as well, and some perhaps not so much. I mean, just to pick out a few points, I think overall we see citizens' assemblies as a positive option, a positive sort of step. Not necessarily a silver bullet, but I think in general, there is this feeling that they will deliver. When people are confronted with all of the evidence in a sort of dispassionate way on, for example, climate change, the real risks and the possible solutions, they will generally come up with quite progressive solutions. Things that, as Chris said, and as was said by somebody in your presentation, go beyond where the government currently is, or beyond where the government thinks that it might be able to go without risking a big backlash. And that's perhaps why there is a sort of, more sympathy for citizens' assemblies on the political left than on the political right. That may be one of the reasons. And I think, the other comment in your presentation about, people, it being a misconception that people, average members of the public are not capable of engaging with these issues, or that it'll be too complex for them. I think that is, as you've said, is just a misconception. I mean, just on a personal level, I mean, in the UK, we have this system of jury service, where at any point in your adult life, you could be called up to serve as on a jury in a court. And I did that once, and you encounter a complete cross-section of society, but the common factor is that people took their job very seriously and engaged very attentively with complex details of criminal cases. So I think, as you said, that's a misconception. I think a couple of things can be, are particularly valuable about citizen assemblies. I mean, as I've sort of suggested already, they can give political cover to politicians to do things that they might otherwise be nervous of touching, whether it's things like, changing diets so that we reduce consumption of meat and dairy products, or taxation of aviation, for example, things that politicians find it very difficult to address, or are fearful will lead to some sort of backlash. Demonstrating that actually those are options that a randomly selected group of citizens think are acceptable, can give politicians the political space to move in that direction. Another thing I think that's very important and very valuable is that citizens' assemblies address things in the round. So, they look at the whole picture, and this is something we don't do well at EU level. But I mean, to give you an example, if you say to a local community, do you want a wind farm at the end of your road? The answer will likely be, no, I'm good, thanks. Happy not to have a wind farm at the end of my road. But if you take the same community and you sit down with them and say, well, look, here's the problem on climate change. We could solve this through doing various different things. We could tax private transport, we could put VAT on airline fuel, eat less meat, do radical insulation of buildings, which would be disruptive. We could, put a wind farm at the end of your road. You might find that people say, oh, actually, a wind farm at the end of the road doesn't sound like a bad idea, So I think, we need to give people the full picture, rather than just saying to them, here's a public consultation on an EU directive on vehicle emission standards. Please send in your feedback on that. So that's important. And on governance, I mean, I think several of our national offices said it's very important that it be set up and managed in a sort of independent way. So there've been problems when governments have set something up but tried to manage the scope or somehow limit the discussions, and so that doesn't terribly work. And in turn, one of the things that's important is that if there is a citizens' assembly, that it be a way of engaging the wider public in the debate. So I think, I mean, my colleague from WWF Spain, I think, is on the call, but one of the points she made is that, if all the citizens on the assembly, they're all anonymous, if everything is happening behind closed doors, it doesn't have the sort of benefit of generating public debate, because the public can't follow along with, the deliberations of the panel. And finally, I'd also just agree with the importance of, framing expectations. I mean, this is deliberative democracy. It's not participative democracy. People on the panel, on the assembly, they need to understand that their role is to, as I think you said, make proposals, but they will then be acted on. And I think it's unhelpful if the government at the outset, as I think happened in France, said, we will implement all the proposals, but then in practice doesn't. I think governments, need to be clear how things are going to be followed up on. Yeah, I mean, I'll stop there, but happy to answer other questions. Oh, and just on your point about NGOs not being engaged in this, I mean, that's not something I've heard back from my WWF network, other than, in some cases there just isn't the capacity to engage with the Citizens' Assembly, or sometimes there's a feeling that, although we've been involved in providing information to the citizens as sort of independent experts, it's important to let the process run its course, and our focus is then more on, ensuring that the government accurately or sort of appropriately implements those things rather than ignores them.
Thank you, Alex. That's very useful perspective. And I'm going to bring Stephanie in first, but then maybe we can come back a little bit more to the engagement of NGO point, because I think one of the feedbacks, at least in some countries, when we talk to NGOs, sometimes you hear that, well, let's see what recommendations come out of the assembly, and then we decide how we engage with it, where I think to make Climate Assembly impactful, it's important to have engagement earlier on, and maybe we can come back to that point. But I with that thought, I think I'll pass on to Stephanie. Stephanie, welcome, and I'm interested to hear your perspective on the role that civil society in particular could play in making sure that climate assemblies are more impactful. And also, you've been leading the project at Knoca on framing climate assemblies. So I'm wondering, what are your findings in terms of do NGOs have a role to play in deciding or in guiding what should climate assembly focus on? So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on your excellent research. It's very helpful and very very interesting for all of us. So I think just as a preface, I was also I led the climate and energy program at Greenpeace globally, and part of my interest in climate assemblies has also been questioning how civil society, especially environmental NGOs, can move more into more from an oppositional space to a propositional space. Because I think one of the great maladies that we're all dealing with right now in politics is polarization. There's the short-term political gain, which has created a situation in which this sort of battle environment has prevented strong policy from emerging in many cases. And so, I think politicians are in some ways rightly concerned that citizens are substituting them, but that's because, there's clearly been a failure in governance for all of these decades. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this scenario of intense crisis with regards to our, to our planetary boundaries and our capacity for survival in the future. So I think that I find there's a bigger critique around how some of the more established organizations have been operating in recent years, to be honest, where they've been much, and I think that's also why we've seen, the explosion of, Fridays for Future, and to a lesser extent, Extinction Rebellion, and the Green Deal movement, Sunrise Movement in the United States, because I think many of the established NGOs, they haven't really been focused on building power, which is essentially what's needed in order to overcome the the role of lobbyists, I find it ironic that there's a concern from political leadership that the public might be subject to lobbyists when we know very clearly how many of the decisions in government are being taken. So I think that it's not entirely surprising that this hasn't risen to the level of sort of top priority for many of the environmental organizations. And I think it absolutely should. And but whoever is organizing the assembly, should think about the role before, during, and after of broader civil society. Same with with the media, with unions, with others. I do think there needs to be an education process of how this can really sort of be the vector for bringing a lot of issues forward, and developing what has been missing in many cases in the environmental movement, which is a much more intersectional approach, so that we don't just say jobs as an afterthought, but that human, let's say, economic security and dignity is really a part of the solution finding that comes forward. So I think it's I haven't been involved in so many countries, but my observation has often been that it can be easier to involve religious movements, unions, others compared to the environmental NGOs, because there can be sort of a territorial issue in some places, or, as I say, just a question of priorities and approach. I think that I'm a bit cynical at the moment about the impact issue. I think you can have a wonderful assembly, and unless there's really quite a lot of continued involvement, pressure, campaigning from civil society, a lot of the recommendations can die there. So I do think that it's just strategically valuable to bring in as much of sort of the campaigning, pressure, advocacy components of civil society early, so that then you can sort of build in a process for having them help to be guardians once the Citizens Assembly or the Civic Assembly has done its job and come up with the recommendations. I think there are many good arguments for why civil society should be involved. As I say, it helps to build a narrative of solutions and not antagonism. I think there are many politicians who see civil society as naysayers, as anti-development. Of course, we all know that's rather old school thinking, but it's still very, very prevalent. Especially the further you get from the Nordic countries and maybe UK and Germany. I think that's a lot of that education hasn't really happened. A lot of that shift hasn't happened. I think there's just a possibility for bringing in just much more knowledge. Having this sort of crowdsourced approach, which in theory, civil society should be very much in favor of and attentive to, by enhancing the number of touch points for sharing experience and enabling good policy to be made. And then I think it's an amazing opportunity to rebuild enthusiasm for deliberative processes. I think one of the great problems right now is that people have forgotten how to engage with one another, how to engage with politics, and having enough of a platform and sort of building this up as a model is really important. And I mean, I'm finding that also in the framing research that I've done, and the proposals that I would make about how to think about framing, is that process is everything. Process is really critical. And the story that you tell about how you have sourced the questions, how you've identified priorities, what's going to be done at every stage of the process is possibly more important than than what comes out in the end. Because I think that the key value of the assembly isn't substituting citizens for scientists, but rather understanding what the trade-offs are that people are willing to accept, where they place values, but it's not a situation where you devolve all of the responsibility to the assembly. There still needs, like, the more leadership there is from everybody involved to sort of create the context and create the supportive environment for the recommendations to be moved forward, and for the country or the region to be on the side of mitigation and adaptation. I think the more positive the process is overall. Like, if it's done in an unsupported island, clearly the results are going to be inferior than if there's a much broader sort of civil society effort as well, to bring forward the importance and sort of seize the opportunity that the assembly offers.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's really great, great feedback. I think we have a few questions in the chat, and I wanted to pick, let's pick the one from Tilly Peck. I'm just going to read it. So Tilly says, it's not just about the positive attitude of policy actors towards climate assemblies. I think our final or broader aim is to turn decision-making in climate policy and any other policy more knowledge-based, more informed, more forward-looking, deliberative, focused on common good. In that sense, how to get the current politicians and policymakers on board and inspired with abolishing the existing job. Anyone would like to take that? Chris, please.
Yeah, I don't think it's about abolishing their existing job. It's about helping to do their job better. So I work with politicians, and they are extremely time poor. And I work on a committee which does this scrutiny work of policy, takes evidence, and comes up with hopefully consensual conclusions. The time that politicians have to devote to that work is nowhere near enough to do the job properly. So to have a group of people who are learning in detail about all aspects of the policy, talking about it, deliberating, making those trade-offs, and then agreeing, hopefully, with a set of recommendations, is an extremely powerful tool for them to have confidence in the decisions which the politicians, ultimately make. So they're not being replaced, they're being better informed and able to do their job much better.
Thank you, Chris. Very well put. Graham, I know Graham has a question as well. You have the floor.
In some ways, Chris just answered or gave an answer to this, but I'm just wondering whether, certainly from some of the other research that's being done with another knowledge development project, one of the things that's come out from policy officials, and I also think the same may be true from civil society actors, is that they don't always know what to do with this kind of input. So they're used to seeing surveys, they're used to engaging with stakeholders. Surveys are clear type of input. Stakeholders you kind of have an ongoing dialogue with. Then suddenly you get this thing that comes from 100 people who have been thinking about an issue for a number of days. And for a number of policymakers, the first time they know about it is when their recommendations land on their desk. And I think there's a really interesting problem for us. And I'd set this up as a problem that we might be able to get these champions, people like Chris and others who kind of are willing to take this sort of project forward, but actually trying to, and it goes back to something that Stephanie was saying, actually getting people to follow alongside the assembly, particularly other policy officials who are very busy people, is actually very difficult. And so the challenge is that they suddenly find out about it right at the end. And very often for politicians and other civil servants, it really can be quite a bad reaction to that, because suddenly they've got this bunch of citizens who are saying, "Oh, you should do this." And so I guess I'm wondering if is there always going to be a tension until these things, and I guess partly this is Tila's question as well, become a much more common part of the policy process? Are we sort of at the vanguard, and therefore we've got to accept that we've got a bit of a problem here trying to persuade civil servants, persuading civil society actors in this space that this is a legitimate way of doing policy making?
Stephanie.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think there does need to be sort of a concerted, media outreach campaign. It's, I know that practically with the French being a notable exception, it's very difficult to attract media attention to the assemblies, and without that process, it does sort of fall out of the blue for many politicians, and also for the society as a whole, and then they have to grapple with the questions of legitimacy and transparency and all the rest of it. And I think it's also notable that in the French case, there were many more questions about legitimacy because it was so heavily mediatized, whereas maybe in some of the others, it wasn't, where they didn't have the same sort of like range and impact. It wasn't, it wasn't seen as so much of a problem. But yeah, I mean, I hope that we can get some award-winning. Some Oscar-winning documentaries out of Citizens Assembly soon, that kind of thing, so that to demystify the process, and also to get to do the intentional work of building allies at all levels, in civil society, in institutions and in government, so that they can sort of see the opportunity for sort of liberating policymakers to make the decisions that they feel are right. Rather than what they perceive as what the public will accept, and also building sort of the context, the container for greater accountability.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have a couple of minutes before we go to the breakout groups. So I just wanted to pick on Ellie's question. It's a big question. I wonder if anyone would brave to answer it in a minute or so. But the question is, with an assembly still being advisory and not having decision-making power, how can we make sure that the impact of citizens' assemblies are increased and that decision makers properly consider, respond, and take on board recommendations? Does anyone have thoughts on this one?
Well, I could sort of think out loud briefly. I mean, I think, in one sense, they must remain advisory. As we said, I mean, they are not the decision-making bodies. They don't have a democratic mandate to do that. But I think, on the other hand, the more we can do to show that they work, and that politicians have been well advised and have been helped to set up effective citizen assemblies, and therefore had a positive experience, and have found that it did, as Chris said, did help bring something useful to their jobs and help them do their jobs, and that they felt better informed. The more positive examples we can have, the more likely it is that governments will be prepared to implement citizens' assemblies and respond positively to the recommendations they make. I think, yeah, the more you can do on the process and the governance and the sort of legitimacy of the process, then the more likely it is that recommendations will be at least considered seriously, even if on individual things the government says, well, actually we can't do that, and here's why, because it's contrary to our undertakings under international law, which is not something that troubles the British government at the moment. But yeah, and I also just wanted to say, I thought, Stephanie, your point about polarization was very important, in that we are all to a very large extent living in our little social media bubbles, and citizens' assemblies, I think, are a possible small way of cutting through that and bringing together a whole cross section of people who wouldn't otherwise normally interact. and that's part of their legitimacy and value.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you to all of you, Chris, Alex, and Stephanie, for really great points and great questions. I'm not going to summarize because we don't end the discussion here. We're now going into the breakout groups. You'll see the questions for discussion in the chat. You have about 15 minutes to go through them. Please nominate in each group someone who will report back to the plenary on your key findings. So we're going to be back in 15 minutes. So 4:15 set. Frederick, could you please put us in the groups? Thank you.
Yeah, they're open now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So we are coming back. Let's see, a few people are still bouncing back now. The 15 minutes went really quick, at least for our group, but I hope you managed to have good discussions. So we're just going to go group by group and report very briefly. So if you could take a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes maximum to report back on what your key messages were from the groups, that would be great. So I go to group 1 first. Who is reporting for group 1? Just take the floor, please.
I think, am I group 1? I don't know.
I know that Chris Shaw was in group 1.
Yeah,
So,
that's
yeah.
my group, yes. Yeah, so we discussed the first question, we talked about a barrier in terms of just this concept of randomness, which has been kind of touched on before, but yeah, just this kind of like basic fear to, oh, this is a random group of people. We can't do that. But then we pointed out that Alex's like metaphor of like jury, well, comparison to jury service, and also this idea of kind of like computer random generator stuff to, yeah, overcome that barrier. Also the fact that it's obviously citizen assembly is a policy really strongly tied towards like XR and other green activists, and how that can cause issues for a certain type of politician. We didn't really have a solution to that, because like the fact that XR has been calling for citizen assemblies has probably helped a lot in the fact that we've had so many in the last few years. But yeah, that was an interesting discussion. And then the second question, we talked about how we can engage climate policy actors by really selling this as a way to overcome the decreasing trust in politicians in many countries. It can be a really good counterweight to populism and help engage and generate trust in the political process, and that goes 2 ways. But on the other hand, we kind of said that that really depends on what government and what people in the government we're talking about, and not everyone, especially I think we were kind of talking in the context of the UK, are interested in increasing trust and participation. And the people who don't care perhaps don't hold much sway within the government at the moment, and how can we change that? And then, yeah, I also mentioned that I work within the democratic engagement climate change charity, and people didn't really know much until I started talking about citizens assemblies, and they kind of held a lot of the misconceptions that were explained at the start. So kind of general education would help to overcome barriers. And then the third question, we talked maybe we could engage with groups that represent marginalized communities, in a way to say citizens assemblies are a way to ensure that we have like a just transition, and that people who are from marginalized communities can have their voices heard in a citizens assembly process. And then also Chris pointed out that we should try to engage with politicians, and there was a question over, is this local at the local level or on the national level? And I was asking, are we going to have any more national level citizens assemblies? And Chris said he's working on it. But basically that they need the political demand, and this can be generated like at the local level through local assemblies. That's it.
Great points. Thank you, Ellie. Actually, for all groups, if you already have notes, you can also post them in the Google Doc. That way, the link that was shared, that way we're capturing those ideas. And also, if anyone wants to post additional ones, please feel free to do so even after this meeting. I'm going to go to group 2 now. Who is reporting on that?
I know that Tila was in that group, if she wants to.
Oh dear. Yeah, we had a very fruitful discussion. So the barriers, additional barriers, the mismatch by politicians, that they think that these people participating in the assemblies will replace them or will take their seats, plus the misconception that maybe this is a bit wider, that citizens need to be experts to actually participate. No, they need to be citizens. That's the point of it. Then how to get politicians' attention on the findings, make them realize that this work is serious, and maybe one can be a solution as well, but I think it's not practiced that widely yet. How to get politicians to observe the process, to invite them to the weekends or whatever is taking place. Turku in Finland did it, and they had rather positive feedback. Oh, citizens can have such civilized conversations. Wow, eye-opening. We tried that with Tartu, that we just finished on Sunday. No politician turned up, but what can you do? But how to use that as an opportunity, and how to promote it as a great chance for them. Then greenwashing issues, but please help me. No, I can't find the right person. Emil, you talked about this.
Yes, we had a brief conversation about the sort of one fear that has been experienced from a political level, being this sort of not being able to deliver on the recommendations that are being made, and as such, essentially fearing greenwashing. And not quite sure we arrived at a conclusion on that, but yeah, we'll get deeper into it on chance.
Thank you. That's very useful.
But to end with, we didn't cover the second question. We didn't have time, but the third one, what actors should Knoca engage? Media, and how to make citizen and climate assemblies more communicable or newsworthy. And then skeptics and critics of assemblies, definitely them as well, to convince them, but also to kind of get their viewpoints, and plain language and political lobbying experts, like how to frame the assemblies, how to make them newsworthy, all that. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Tilly. And engaging skeptics has been the biggest challenge for the study. So it's always difficult to actually get the views directly. Great points. Group 3, please.
I know that Alex was in that one. I don't know if he wants to.
Well, I don't know. We didn't really agree on who would report back, and I didn't. I think hear all the start of the conversation. I'm afraid we didn't really do our homework. We didn't answer the questions. We sort of started with the first one and then had a very interesting discussion, mainly about the Austrian experience. We had several participants who were able to speak on that, and talking about, you know, one of the problems anyway has been that the participants in the Austrian Citizens Assembly, Council, I think it was called, but have just been sort of overwhelmed by the, you know, what they're being asked to do, and the sort of the scale of the problem, and that the, you know, the scope of seems to be everything from, you know, power sector to food security, and then implications of war in Ukraine and so on. And you know, there's the problem that in government you've got the Greens who are very keen on this citizens assembly and want sort of very concrete outcomes, whereas Conservatives absolutely don't. And so that's a problem, and also that, you know, there's a concern that if, you know, the recommendations aren't ultimately implemented, you know, the media might paint this as being, you know, the Greens to blame, right? Because the Greens are in government, and yet we still don't get implementation of whatever recommendations citizens have come up with. But I don't know if others want to add anything. One other comment was that on climate change, unlike maybe some other topics on which we, you know, deliberative democracy is used, it is, I mean, it's overwhelming in some ways, but it's also quite clear what we need to do. You know, we have to cut emissions to net emissions to zero anyway by whenever it is, a few decades time, we know roughly how you do that. And actually, you know, although I said in my intervention earlier, you know, we need to confront citizens with all of the different options for cutting emissions. I mean, the truth is we have to pretty much do everything. You know, you can't just build wind turbines and carry on flying and eating lots of red meat and cheese. You know, the only way we're going to stop runaway climate change is by throwing the kitchen sink at the problem and basically doing a lot of work in all sectors. And so part of citizens' assemblies, I guess, is confronting citizens with that reality, the scale of changes needed and the pace of change that's needed.
Thank you, Alex. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm miserably failing as a chair in terms of timekeeping because of all the great points which are coming up, but we still have 3 groups now and just a few minutes left. So may I ask group 4, 5, and 6 to just take 1 minute to report on your findings. So group 4 is next. I think it was Lizzie.
Oh, great. Just very quick feedback. Katarina shared interesting examples from Finland, that there's some existing established engagement processes that policy actors have to do. And Katarina was saying that actually it's sometimes those policy leaders who are most resistant to going beyond those existing methods and considering citizens' assemblies. So there's some barriers there. And we were also talking about kind of there's the initial barrier of convincing policy actors to consider these processes, but then ensuring that they're using them in the most appropriate way as well. So choosing the right method for the question or the purpose they've got is another barrier that we didn't think had perhaps come up already. In terms of what Knoca can do, we talked about media coverage as well, supporting NGOs to advocate and for more citizens' assemblies, perhaps providing materials, kind of more examples of impact, really about impact of these processes, and then also maybe a role in putting pressure on policy actors to follow up from the processes as well, were just some ideas.
Thank you, Lizzie. Group 5.
Hi, this is me. I'll be really brief because loads of points have already been made, but also just to say we didn't really focus on the questions, I think. But one thing, I think partly because of the makeup of the group, was we talked about the role of sort of environmental movements or activist groups or NGOs or other civil society actors within assemblies, engaging them before, during and after, but also this problem that they might be pushing for assembly process, but then might abandon them because they don't agree with the framing or the way that it's the decisions are made, and how to overcome that, how to build trust with that side of it, whereas also building trust with and sort of building knowledge around climate assemblies within sort of more the government and policy side. And I think we thought it was quite important actually to have them engaged, because for impact we need buy-in and pressure from civil society groups long term, and that these groups could play a really important role in that sense and holding government to account. So if we don't have buy-in from them, that process is jeopardized. I'm sure I've missed 100 different points that were made, but I thought I'd keep it short.
Thank you, Christina. And last but not least, group 6. Is anyone still with us from that group?
I'll jump in on that one, just because it also gives me a chance to say thank you for running the event, Alina. But a lot of the things that have been said we were talking about, but I think one thing that came up at the end, which I thought was really interesting, was about the challenge with messaging, particularly amongst people, actors who are overloaded, and how we even begin to deal with that is a really interesting question. And I think it was more of a challenge rather than an answer, I'm afraid, but recognizing how overloaded these actors are and trying to find space on their agendas. But certainly on behalf of Knoca, thank you, Alina, for this. It's been a really interesting opportunity to talk about assemblies from a very different perspective than we usually do. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you so much to all of the panel members and to all of you who joined us today for contributing to the discussion with questions and ideas. There is information in the chat on the upcoming events. Please take note, and we're looking forward to seeing you soon again. Thank you.